super excited to welcome Leonard Armato to our new show on Essentially Sports. And for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure there's not a lot of people who don't know, Leonard is an industry veteran in the sports business. Among some of the biggest accomplishments, he managed Shaquille O'Neal, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon, started the sport of beach volleyball. Is that right, Leonard? Am I getting that right? Among many other things. Yeah, go ahead.
No, they founded the AVP Pro Beach Volleyball Tour, and we were able to get beach volleyball in the Olympic Games, give women equal prize money for the first time of any sport, and now it's a championship sport at the NC2A level, and the fastest growing sport among young girls and women in general. So yeah, I was the founder of the Pro Beach Volleyball Tour.
Yeah, I think what's super fascinating, Leonard, about your story is not only have you been a super agent for so long, as a sports management major myself, in school, we learned a lot about you and the specific ability that you had of combining brand building with athletes in a time where that was, now I say it and everyone thinks it's the norm, but as you know, you were a trailblazer in that front. And I think a great place to kick this off is talking about how you broke into the sports management field. And this was obviously long before you created the brands for Shaq, Oscar De La Hoya, right? The whole Golden Boy story we'll get into. How were you able to break into the industry?
Well, it was really difficult, Vishal. I mean, when I started in the industry, there were a few big time agents that kind of controlled the business. And I tried to get a job with each one of them and they all rejected me. So the only way I could break in was to try to get a client on my own. And with no experience, that is particularly difficult. So I played basketball in college and I was a practicing lawyer, and my college basketball coach, a guy named Stan Morrison, who coached at USC and the University of Pacific and various other schools, told me that I should be in sports law. And I should be in sports law because so many athletes were getting taken advantage of. And I told him, I said, Stan, I'd love to, but I don't have any clients. And he said, well, you're just going to have to go all in and get out there and get a client. And, be fully committed to it, because without full commitment, you can never achieve greatness. And there's this little saying that only those who dare to achieve greatly, only those that dare to fail greatly can achieve greatly. So yep. I quit my job and I decided I was going to be a sports agent lawyer. And so Stan Morrison, my coach, said, by the way, I'm going to set you up with a meeting for a potential client. And he was a basketball coach at USC at the time. And I told him, Stan, I just don't think that you have any NBA players on your team. None of them are good enough to make the league. And he said, no. This isn't an NBA player. This is a player on my team that's going to be a superstar in the NFL. And I said, what? And he said, yes, his name is Ronnie Lott. Ronnie Lott was a All-American at USC safety and one of the absolute all-time NFL greats. But at the time, he was going to be drafted at the top of the NFL draft. So Stan Morrison set a meeting up between myself and Ronnie Lott. And I sat down at the meeting and I was very nervous because I didn't know what I was going to be able to say to him. And what I thought about was, what is my value proposition? What is it that sets me apart from the other people that are recruiting him, those big time agents that have a whole stable of clients? And so what I said to myself is, you know what? You could devote your entire life to this guy because you don't have any clients. So I went into the meeting with that mindset. My value proposition was my time, my enthusiasm, my energy, my effort that I could bring that nobody else could bring. So we sat down and he asked me how many clients I had. And I said, well, Ronnie, I don't have any. And he looked kind of funny at me and he said, well, how much experience do you have in sports law? And I said, well, I don't have any. And he looked at me like, what accomplishment do you have as a lawyer? And I said, well, I don't have any, but I'm very enthusiastic. I have a lot of time. And he cut me off and he said, look, I don't think this is going anywhere. And I said, look, Ronnie, let me ask you just a couple questions before you adjourn this meeting. Number one, what do you want to accomplish on the football field? And he said, well, I want to be all pro. I want to be the best. I said, well, that's amazing. I said, well, what do you want to accomplish off the field? He said, well, I want to own car dealerships. I want to be a successful businessman. And I said, well, that's incredible. And I said, how do you want to be remembered? He said, I want to be remembered as somebody that gave back to the community. I want to help youth, especially underprivileged youth. And I said, well, those are three incredible goals. And let me just tell you this. If you were going to go with any of those fancy, high-powered agents that are out there right now that are recruiting you, they probably have 30, 40, 50 clients each. And if they treated them all equally, they would be able to give you 5, 6, 7 minutes a day of attention. But me, on the other hand, I could give you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year of focused attention. I would be devoted only to you. And he looked at me like, okay, that sounds good, but you have no experience and I have no confidence you could do the job. So I thought to myself, I took a deep breath. I said, well, look, let me make you an offer you can't refuse. I mean, you've seen The Godfather, famous line from The Godfather, an offer you can't refuse. He said, what? I said, let me work for you for free for 30 days. And If you don't think I'm the best in the world, if you don't think I'm the best for you, I'll walk away. We could shake hands. You owe me nothing. How about that? And he stood there. He was stunned. And he said, interesting. Why don't you go tell my parents about that? So I said, okay. So he called up his parents and he said, Leonard's coming to see you. I drove out to Riverside. Actually, it's San Bernardino, Rialto, California, about an hour outside of LA.
Yeah.
I sat in the living room of Mr. and Mrs. Lott. I said, Mr. and Mrs. Lott, I'm going to work for your son for 30 days to prove I'm the best for him. What do you think? And they looked at each other and they said, what a nice young man. He's willing to prove himself. I said, so we're in, right? They said, yeah. I called Ronnie. I said, let's go. So that's how I started with Ronnie Lott. And the story goes on from there, but that's the very beginning. What I tell young people who want to break into the business, always identify your value proposition and don't be afraid to work for free. Because if you prove yourself, if you make yourself indispensable, then you're going to be successful.
No, I love that story because it kind of shows that journey of like taking action, right? And I think you even hit on this, but you kind of have to develop the confidence in yourself and ability to execute even before you go into that meeting, right? With Ronnie, you kind of already knew, hey, if it comes to be, I'm going to work for free and make sure I prove some sort of value prop for him, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was the only way in because I couldn't compete with the knowledge these other people had, the experience, their accomplishments. And, the one interesting thing about professional athletes is they have generally pretty big egos and they want to be treated super special. So I also wanted to kind of lean into that as well and just let him know he would be the only one and I would be completely focused on him.
No, I mean, that's such a great lesson for anybody watching that's trying to break into sports or even in the sports world, right? To learn firsthand from these stories on how you broke in. I mean, a lot of people have that question, right? So I'm glad we started there to give the audience kind of some context, right, on how you broke in, which is why this first segment is perfect to lead in because we're going to be talking about the top stories, right, in sports of the last week and kind of getting your thoughts and take given your connection to all these athletes. I think a great place to start would be something that, Shaq went pretty viral in the news when he was speaking to Nikola Jokić, and he said that he thought that SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, should be the MVP of the league instead of him when Jokić won the award. And I think this is super relevant because Shaq has been accused multiple times of like putting down other big men. You know, his relationship with Dwight Howard was certainly controversial to say the least. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that and where kind of these comments come from him, as you know, he has such a bubbly, happy-go-lucky personality, but it seems like with these big men, there's always kind of these like petty comments and jabs in the media from him.
Well, you know, you have to understand the brilliance of Shaq.
Yeah.
I mean, he does things very often to motivate people. And, you know, it's not just with big men. I mean, he's done it with other athletes before and basically chided them to perform at a higher level. And it sort of worked. I remember he did it with Donovan Mitchell, who isn't a big man. And he said, you know, was basically telling him he needed to step up his game if he wanted to be a true superstar in the league. And he would do it in order to motivate. And I'll give you a great example with Nikola Jokić. He loves Jokić. In fact, he called him the best player in the league. And he kind of acted as if Jokić wasn't stepping up to the game that he thought Jokić was capable of, being the best player in the world. And guess what happened? Jokić had just lost 2 games in a row. And what happened the last 2 games? Jokić stepped up, and all of a sudden the Nuggets, who people completely counted out, said they were dead. They won 2 games in a row on the other team's court, at the Timberwolves court, and Jokić performed like an MVP, like the best player in the world. So Shaq has a method to his madness. And I'll tell you a little story to just show you what an incredible, instinctive marketer that Shaq is. Because, you know, controversy causes, you know, marketing interest. So when there's a little bit of controversy, and Shaq just knows exactly how far to push it. If you can recall, when Shaq was playing in the league, everyone said he hated David Robinson. Now, he would always say, David Robinson refused an autograph when I was a little kid, and I have to show him that I still remember that. And every time they played, the reporters, the announcers would say, well, Shaq and David Robinson don't like each other because he reportedly refused Shaq an autograph when Shaq was a young man. And it was a really interesting sort of rivalry that was supposedly founded in this bitterness that Shaq had about David Robinson refusing him an autograph. So I ran into David Robinson at the All-Star game a few years ago, and he said, hey, I got to tell you this story about me and Shaq. And I said, what? David Robinson said, Shaq and I were on the dream team together, and we got on the bus after practice. And I decided to sit next to Shaq and say, Shaq, hey, what's the deal here? Because you keep telling everybody I refused you an autograph and you're really mad at me. And Shaq looked at David Robinson and he said, no, man, that never happened. That's just marketing. So, and they've been really good friends ever since. So, I mean, Shaq does, and if you notice, he gets in these battles with people, but he always ends it with sort of, you know, a wink in his eye and love at the end. And, you know, like he had a rap battle with Damian Lillard, and they were like dissing each other. And then at the end, they're really good buddies. So Shaq knows just how far to push it. He knows just how far what it takes to motivate people. And at the end of the day, he's good-hearted, good-natured, and really is not malicious in anything he does.
So he really comes up with stuff on top of his head. Is there like a PR team? Like, is this something you
No.
Okay.
No. He says, I've got these homeboy marketing instincts, and he does have incredible marketing. He has incredible instincts for creating marketing spin, marketing interest, and interest in people, things. And he does it in a way that pushes the envelope, but never too far. And that's why he's the most loved athlete celebrity out there.
Wow, that's fascinating and such a the David Robinson story. I remember reading that in his book as a kid, and now knowing it's he made it up.
He made it up. He made it up just to create interest in the game. He create interest in the rivalry. I mean, the guy's genius when it comes to stuff like that. He's genius. And I represented him, and we worked on all kinds of stuff together. And sometimes he wouldn't even tell me. until later.
That's
So
what I
it
was
was
going to
just,
ask. I was like, were you aware of everything that he
I didn't
kind of,
know.
yeah,
No, he didn't even tell me. He
yeah.
didn't even tell me. He just did it on his own. He does stuff on his own. He goes off the reservation, but never too far.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. You got to keep him in check a little bit. I mean, I love that we're on the topic of Shaq because what's also relevant in the last few weeks is his ex-wife released a book that has gotten a lot of negative PR. And among a lot of the things she wrote about, she, said she was never in love with him. A lot of aspects of their relationship. I think, at times like these, how do athletes, especially in Shaq's stature, deal with handling this public outcry and fallout in their personal lives? And like, how do you advise them strategy wise on dealing with things like this? Because it's really not under their control, right?
Right. And I think Shaq's handled the whole, Shawnee book divorce thing beautifully. I mean, he took responsibility for mistakes he made in the marriage for sure. But I don't know how that reflects unfavorably upon him when she says she never loved him because she married him. So how do you marry somebody that you never really loved? That's a little weird. But I think Shaq was saying, yeah, I understand how she feels. And he basically didn't take the bait and get into some, back and forth and mudslinging. He just basically said, yeah, she's right. I should have done things better. And I take responsibility for the failed marriage. So, again, I think he comes out looking good in the whole thing and really did handle things in the right way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you think his response via social media was the appropriate thing to do? Like if you were, yeah. And
I believe so.
And how much, in terms of just in general, right, in your scope on social media and how that has clearly changed the business, especially when it comes to agents, managers, like you said, a lot of this stuff you might find out now when an athlete posts something versus you, in a large part of the narrative you were in control before. Is that as an agent or a manager, is that something that makes you more nervous now, or you're like, no, it creates a lot more good than bad?
Well, I think, the most important thing you can do if you're managing someone, representing someone, is agree on a plan, agree on a positioning, and agree on a communication strategy.
Okay.
And hopefully everything it will be consistent with that. If it isn't consistent with that, of course, you can point it out and see if there's any way to, walk things back or do things differently, which athletes do oftentimes. I mean,
Okay.
you've seen LeBron James do that really effectively at times. He'll say something and it'll be like, oh my gosh, how could you say that? And then he kind of walks it back a little bit because his advisors tell him, hey, maybe you shouldn't have gone that far. But
Yeah.
I think that's what your duty as a manager, an agent, a representative, is
Yeah.
to try to have a communication strategy, a brand positioning for your athlete. And then if they go off the plan, then you just sort of talk to them about it and see if you can pull it back. And,
Yeah.
I think that the more, closely you communicate along those lines, the better.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. Now, shifting gears to another major sport that you were on the forefront of, boxing. You helped Oscar De La Hoya create the entire Golden Boy persona, right? Build that brand. I mean, Oscar reached heights he had never seen before under your leadership, and even managed to land the biggest deal in boxing history, right? For his then Golden Boy promotions with the fighter Canelo Alvarez. And Oscar's been in the news for a spat with Canelo where the latter accused Oscar of stealing from him while they worked together, right? So it's like, what are your thoughts on like these kind of, they were friends, right? Confidants turn foes. And how do you often see such historic deals breaking in your professional work?
Well, Oscar changed the whole face of boxing when we created Golden Boy Promotions. Because in the past, boxers had promoters like Don King, Bob Arum, who took a huge percentage of the revenue in order to promote the fight, and usually with very little, if any, risk. So we just came up with the idea that you could disintermediate them and Oscar could promote his own fights. And that's the foundation of Golden Boy, which turned out to be a great concept. But when you're used to being the star, like Oscar was as a fighter, then it becomes, you know, you have to kind of manage the kind of, let's call it conflict between the star promoter and the star fighter. And, you know, Oscar obviously wants to continue to have his name out there in a huge way. You know, the ego of a boxer, you know, who was once, you know, the most famous boxer in the world is still, you know, intact. So I'm sure there's a little bit of that, a little bit of, you know, jealousy there between the fighter who is, you know, really, really famous and the promoter who's really, really famous. So there's a little bit of that. Also, the boxing business, all these people are always like slinging mud at each other and then they forget it later. I mean, so I've seen that happen over and over again. It happened between Oscar and Bob Arum, and then they made up. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Oscar and Canelo make up because, you know, a lot of the fight game, as you know, is hype and promotion. You know, they pretend like they're really mad at each other and then they get over it. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that.
That's what I was going to ask as a follow-up, like this type of like, you know, breaking of these relationships, especially in the fight game, like it's kind of common for fighters to go through this, and then that promoter-fighter relationship, right? You've probably seen this happen a lot of times.
Yeah, and you know, like I said, the whole boxing game is made up. Is you know, you go to a weigh-in and they're trying to hit each other because you know you want to get more interest in the fight, and they're just used to hyping and promoting things and causing conflict because in boxing, conflict creates more interest. So you know, to the extent of conflict between Oscar and Canelo, their names are in the news and people are more interested in them.
I nailed that point, and curious if this could be an Oscar story in itself. But have you personally, could you remember a similar situation where you had a great association with an athlete, or you were working on a big deal, and it kind of either fell through out of conflict or something, you know, unexpected on your end?
I can't remember a situation, you know, specifically, but it happens all the time. And and it's just one of those things where you just have to, you know, pick up the pieces and go on. But a lot of times in the world of sport, you know, there's conflict, gets resolved. All of a sudden, you never know the two people are, you know, super friendly again. I mean, look, even between Shaquille and I mean, he fired me at one point and then we're great buddies and partners on things. You know, it's just the way it happens.
Yep. Now, this is a topic me and you have chatted about, you know, quite a few times, and I think this is going to be awesome for the audience to hear. Now, the WNBA season is kicking off this week, and, you know, we have Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese making their debuts for the Indiana Fever and the Chicago Sky. Now, there's a lot of hype around, you know, especially Caitlin Clark as being a game changer for the WNBA, and creating a lot of new revenue streams here, especially with the ratings bump that they're expecting to get. Now, you've definitely been, I would say, in the minority when criticizing not only the hype of when it comes to like the WNBA pay gap being mended, but also how realistic it is for this hype to translate into more equal pay. Now, what changes are you seeing in the sport with these debuts that you think will carry over long term?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And let me start with just women's sports in general. You know, women's sports in general enjoys isn't the right word. They are subject to niche audiences when it comes to viewing of their telecasts and their competitions. With the exception of World Cup, if the women are in the World Cup, then there's going to be a huge audience. I mean, 36 million people, I think, watched when the USA won, you know, the World Cup, you know, when Brandi Chastain tore her shirt off. That's a lot of people. And when women are in the Olympic Games, oftentimes you'll get a mass audience watching that. And then Caitlin Clark drew a mass audience. The Caitlin Clark phenomenon, the Caitlin Clark effect, was this great story that people just bought into. Her long distance shooting, her record breaking, all the stuff she was doing in college became water cooler conversation. Now, let's look at the WNBA. When the WNBA launched, and I was a big part of that with David Stern and Adam Silver and Rick Welts back in 1997. We were representing Lisa Leslie, the star of the league.
Okay.
The first WNBA game on national television enjoyed a 3.8 rating. That means that 4.6 million households tuned in to that game, times 2.5 means 11.5 million people watched the first WNBA game. Last year, the WNBA was crowing about how much their ratings had gone up, but the largest audience they got for a WNBA final was 800,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So compare that, 800,000 people to 11.5 million. Now, we go back to the pay idea. Pay is always a function in sports as to the size of the audience that you can generate, mostly on television.
Okay.
So if you generate a large audience on television, you'll get big advertising money, you'll get big sponsorship money, and you're going to be able to provide your athletes with a significant amount of payday. Basketball has the biggest gender pay inequality of any other profession. I think the average salary for a WNBA player is $150,000, and the average salary for an NBA player is $10 million or more. I mean, it's crazy, the gap. But it's because of the audience. The audience just isn't there. So they're saying, is Caitlin Clark, when she goes to the WNBA, going to change the game? I think there'll be a little bit of a bump, but I don't think it's going to go from 800,000 to 3 million per telecast. It's going to go maybe from 800,000, to 900 or a million or something like that.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I think that, and I've been saying this for 20 years plus, one of the reasons that I think the WNBA doesn't get the ratings it could is that 56% of basketball fans say that dunking and alley-oop is the favorite part of the game for them. And you see the highlights on TV, and you'll see constantly highlights involving crazy dunks and fun alley-oops, and they just don't have it as part of their game. And I've been advocating for years that the women should put the rim to 9 feet. In volleyball, the net is lower for women so they can spike. And volleyball as a women's sport is probably more popular than volleyball as a men's sport. If the women had a 9-foot basket and they could dunk, I believe that their television audience would grow dramatically because it would just be more fun to watch. But that's just me, and it's a controversial position, but I'm taking it anyway.
No, I love your take on that position, because I think in addition to the rim suggestion, a lot of points you made about Shaq earlier and being an expert in marketing, right? Creating controversies and rivalries. I think this is super relevant because, we have all these talk shows now, like, First Take, you got Stephen A, you got Shannon Sharp, Skip Bayless, that a lot of times they're breaking down the rivalries, right, between these players in these sports. Now, is there a format for the WNBA to leverage these rivalries to create this media conversation? What's your thought about strategically, maybe it's even pinning Caitlin against Angel like they do in colleges, where you have, right, Tennessee, versus Alabama, or Michigan, Ohio State, right? It's you have these built-in audiences for these rivalries. How do we get Stephen A talking about these things for the WNBA?
Well, I think that Kathy Engelbert, the commissioner, has done a great job bringing in sponsors and increasing the media partnerships, et cetera. And I think this new wave of women coming into the WNBA will be helpful to them. I mean, they've got some high profile, attractive. When I say attractive, I just mean interesting women. Cameron Brink, Angel Reese. There's definitely more names, because without stars, you can't build fan interest at the mass level. Caitlin Clark is a star.
Yep.
Everyone knows who she is. You mention her name, everybody knows who she is. And some of these other women, like Angel Reese, a lot of people know who she is as well. So yes, that helps, because star power drives everything. However, fundamentally, the game is still the same. There's still no dunking. There's still no alley-oops, and people love that who love basketball.
Yeah.
So I think, my opinion, it can only go so far, but I think it will be helpful to like you said, to develop rivalries, to continue to build stars. I think it's all part of growing the audience, growing the fandom.
No, I think that's a great point, and I'm looking forward to definitely the season, right, and seeing how, Caitlin's rookie year and Angel's rookie year progress, especially with the increasing media sentiment. And, on the topic of media, there's been very polarizing news around the NBA's deal with TNT possibly coming to an end. And obviously I don't think I'm only speaking for myself. I feel like every basketball fan's favorite show is the show with Ernie, Kenny, Shaq, and Chuck. And now that Inside the NBA might not exist, that means breaking up Shaq and Barkley. Like, how do you see that from a fan perspective in terms of like the changing NBA media deal landscape? And do you think that Shaq and Chuck would still stay together if they went to another network?
Well, it's a really interesting question. It seemed about a week and a half ago that it was a fait accompli that NBC was going to take the package and TNT was going to get kicked to the curb.
Yeah.
And I know Shaq was thinking that himself. But, I think what's happened is that David Zaslav, who's the head of Warner Brothers Discovery, who owns TNT, doesn't want it to happen that easily. So I think he's fighting hard to keep it. And it's still up in the air what's going to happen. Now, should TNT lose the NBA, the likelihood is that Shaq and Chuck will break up, which would be a shame. But there's one little wild card that you got to keep in mind. Adam Silver and the NBA control who it is that will be reporting on the NBA. So they could say, look, you can't break up Chuck and Shaq.
Oh, interesting.
We just love that combination too much. I've heard that Ernie Johnson, who's like the foundation of the show, doesn't want to leave TNT. But at the same time, you could see Shaq and Chuck go into an NBC, or you could see them go into someplace else, because there's no question that they are the most entertaining duo in all of basketball, and there's no other show that even compares to Inside the NBA.
But do you think it works the same on streaming? Like, at least I'm skeptical that if you take them off of national television and put them on like Amazon Prime, it's just not going to have the same viewership appeal and kind of culture. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, if it was on NBC, it would be even bigger in terms of audience, because NBC has an over-the-air network that reaches even more people than TNT. So yes, it'd be great on NBC. As far as Amazon Prime goes, I wouldn't think the audience on Amazon Prime would be as big as the audience on TNT, because they don't have that history. You've seen that they've done pretty nicely with the NFL, but it took a little while to grow their audience. So I would agree with you that the audience wouldn't be as big if they were on Amazon Prime, at least at the beginning. But Amazon Prime might look at Shaq and Chuck as a way to grow the audience. So, and maybe paying more money because of that. So who knows?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. And, that brings us to another prominent person on the show, Candace Parker, right, who regularly joins them. She was recently named the president of Adidas women's basketball. And I think what's really cool is Shaq, right, was recently the president of Reebok basketball. Can you talk a little bit about his business ambitions? And you alluded to the marketing, the marketing lessons, where he's a marketing genius, like behind closed doors with your personal dealings with him. Did you see this in like his trajectory of, leading a resurgent basketball brand?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of times when celebrities, athletes get attached to a brand, like I remember Lady Gaga was the creative director of HP or something. A lot of times it's like, ho-hum, who cares? It's just like this vanity
thing. It was Kanye that said, I think it was Kodak or something, right? And Kanye was like, what does she know the cameras are.
No, exactly. So it's kind of funny, but with Shaq and Reebok, it's a little different because Shaq feels like there's some unfinished business at Reebok. When we first did our deal with Reebok, Reebok had been eclipsed by Nike as the number one brand and had done incredible stuff in the basketball world. I don't know if you remember the history of Nike and Reebok, but Reebok at one time was number one when they had that aerobic shoe and everybody was wearing those aerobic shoes. And then Nike signed Jordan, they signed Bo Jackson, they came up with Just Do It. And all of a sudden in the late 80s, early 90s, Nike was number one, but they hated Reebok. So there was this big rivalry between the two. Reebok signed Shaq. They started to make some really good marketing and some really good commercials, but then the relationship sort of went sideways, after like 3 or 4 years. And Reebok then tailed off after the Iverson deal, and they just got bought by Adidas. Adidas kind of kicked it to the curb, and they've been wallowing. And Shaq said, look, I want to buy Reebok. I want to be the president of Reebok basketball. I want to bring it back. We have unfinished business. So he's really resolved to take Reebok back to its the promised land of being number one again. I mean, I don't know if that's quite a challenge with Nike being as powerful as it is, but he definitely wants to bring back respect to Reebok, and he's on the road to do that. As far as Candace Parker and Adidas, I know it's hard to really say what that's about. I'm not really sure. I don't know the real relationship there or how much true authority she has to really do things in the Adidas space. But with Shaq and Reebok, I know it's real. I know it's authentic. And I know he wants to do everything possible, to create for Reebok in the basketball space.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And you're right. I love that you said unfinished business, right? And I think that's it sounds like a huge motivator for Shaq is something like unfinished business. But so another thing you've been very vocal about, right, is the gender pay gap in sports. And your volleyball league did a lot of progress in wiping that out. And now Caitlin Clark's Nike deal started a completely different conversation with the likes of Aja Wilson, essentially being ignored. As someone who's seen these decisions up close, like, what do you think drives these scenarios? And more importantly, like, how do they respond to these claims of bias?
Well, it's really interesting. I remember representing Lisa Leslie, and we went to Nike way back when and said, hey, we want a shoe deal. We want a signature shoe. And they laughed at me and said, there's no way. Nobody buys shoes because women wear them. When women play basketball, they look at Michael Jordan and see what he's wearing, and that's what they want to wear. So, we'll pay you a little money, but that's it. They don't, you don't drive any sales for us. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the way our society has been conditioned. We're not conditioned to value female athletes. We're conditioned to value female, let's call it pop icons or musicians. If you look at the top, let's call it women on Instagram, it's the Kardashians and Ariana Grande. And if you look at the top, Instagram men, it's always athletes, Cristiano Ronaldo, LeBron James. We haven't been conditioned to value female athletes, but it's changing. There's a little bit of momentum now behind women's sports. Mm-hmm. We're starting to value them. We're putting more marketing around them. I think about 5 years they did a study and they said, I think they found that 5% of all sports programming is female programming and 3% of all, news coverage is female sports. Yeah. So it's changing. It's gotten more. And, we're making progress little by little. The Caitlin Clark deal is a really good example of that. And then Aja Wilson is now followed. But, 20 years ago, we created with the AVP Pro Beach Volleyball Tour, the first sports league that ever gave women equal prize money and equal TV time. And out of that came Misty May and Carrie Walsh and 3 gold medals at the Olympic Games in a row. And they became actually even bigger than the men. So we started to condition people to value women's beach volleyball athletes. And today it's the fastest growing sport for girls at the college level and at the youth level. So it's exciting. And it's a time of change. And I think there's a real opportunity for women's sports in high growth areas. So, let's take a look at what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. And I think you're going to see some exciting new developments.
I love that you brought up Lisa because, and that's one of the topics I even wanted to dive deeper on that negotiation. But I know you explained a little bit of the high level, like how did you guys end up proving, like really getting her worth, like in that negotiation?
Well, I mean, I went to Ralph Green, who was running Nike Global Basketball at the time. And I begged him, I said, she should be making more money. She should have her own signature shoe. And they just were unwilling to do that. Mm-hmm. She ended up making a deal with Nike and wearing Nike. And Lisa Leslie's an inspiration. She's super articulate. She's an incredible woman. And she was one of the all-time greats in the WNBA. And even today, she's continuing to inspire women. But, back in those days, they didn't have the same momentum that we have today in terms of providing women with more marketing opportunities.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Now, we seamlessly transition into what is definitely going to be my favorite segment of this show, which is story time. Now, we already did a little bit about Lisa, but now this I think is the best kept secret sports branding, in my opinion. What this story is going to be. And I know you've talked about it, Shaq's talked about it, everyone has their own take on this, and the media had its own take when this was unfolding, but you were a critical part in Shaq leaving the Orlando Magic for the LA Lakers. Now, this was a major ripple effect across the league, I would say even professional sports, right, when something like this happened. So media reports at the time talked about you hugging the great Jerry West to close the deal, and that you met Jerry for the first time during the Atlanta Beach Volleyball games. And the Orlando Magic GM, John Gabriel, was also there. Can you talk a little bit about what you spoke about with Jerry at that time and how John Gabriel responded to the first time you told him that Shaq might consider leaving?
Well, I mean, you have to provide context here.
Yeah.
First, I've known Jerry West for many years before that. I represented Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and negotiated Kareem's contract with the Lakers with Jerry. So we were, quite friendly. Shaquille wanted to stay with the Orlando Magic. And the way that the collective bargaining agreement worked was that the team that had an athlete had the exclusive right to negotiate with them up to a certain time. And then if they hadn't reached a deal, then they were a free agent if their contract had run.
Yeah.
And Shaq's contract was up with the Magic, and we started talking with them. And he told me very clearly, I want to stay with the Magic. And I said, okay, let's do a deal with the Magic. So I went to the Magic and I said, okay, let's make a deal. And instead of offering him a max contract, which was the highest amount permitted by the collective bargaining agreement, which, by the way, is regularly offered to any good player today in the league, they offered him less than the max contract, which was highly insulting. and when that happened, Shaq said to me, look, go see if there's anything else out there.
Right.
The minute that they were permitted under the collective bargaining agreement to contact me, Jerry West called me and said, look, we are so interested in Shaquille. And I said, okay, well, make us the best offer you can. And so Jerry called me the next day and said, look, I just made a trade to create some cap room. I just traded George Lynch away, and I can offer Shaq a $96 million contract for 6 years, I believe it was. And I said to him, look, Jerry, $96 million won't get it done because Alonzo Mourning just signed a $100 million agreement, and Shaq is better than Alonzo Mourning. So just from a respect standpoint, he's got to get more than that. And so Jerry hung up the phone and he said, okay, let's see what I can do. he called me the next day. And I was keeping Shaq aware of these conversations, of course, and other teams in the league were interested. But the Lakers were particularly an interesting option because of their heritage and their history. And Jerry West's, obviously his pedigree as someone who had guided many championships. So Jerry called me the next day and says, I've done something that I'm really scared about, because if you don't end up accepting this offer, I'm going to probably lose my job. And I said, what? He said, well, I just traded Vlade Divac to the Sacramento Kings, so I have no center now. And he said, and through that trade, we have received the number 13 pick in the first round of the draft from the Charlotte Hornets. And I said, okay. And he said, listen, we can give you $121 million. That should do it, right? And I said, I think that's really fair, and I'll tell Shaquille. So I told Shaquille $121 million will be the highest paid player in the NBA. He said, that sounds great. Let's do it. And we'll meet down in Atlanta to sign the deal, because Shaq was on the Olympic team and we were all going down to Atlanta for the Olympics. So Jerry West went to Atlanta. I went to Atlanta. Shaq was already in Atlanta. And my wife was playing she wasn't my wife at the time, but Holly McPeak, who is now my wife, was playing in the Olympic Games and practicing on a beach volleyball court, getting ready for the games. And we were staying, nearby there. So John Gabriel had heard that Shaq was going to sign with the Lakers. So he flew down and he came to see me on the volleyball court while my wife was practicing and I was sort of like hanging out. And he said, hey, I got a better deal for you now. And I said, John, I think it might be too late, but I'll tell Shaq about it. And so he's like, oh gosh. And so he walked away. But there was never any, situation where we were all together other than that. That night, we met Jerry West in a hotel in Atlanta. And that's when Shaq ended up signing the deal. And that's what ended up happening.
Wow. Now, I mean, there's so many follow-ups to that. I would be curious from Shaq's standpoint, right? I think, he was vocal about he loved playing in Orlando, bringing Orlando that championship and kind of building a legacy there. Like what was his kind of thought process at that time? And like, how did he kind of accept the fact that like, okay, I'm going to leave Orlando and I'm not going to build the legacy that, I initially wanted to in Orlando?
Well, I think he was really disappointed by the offer that the Magic had made. And in retrospect, they know they made a big mistake. So, at the time, I was supposedly the villain trying to take him out of Orlando, but really...
But that's what I remember, is you were really the villain, that the media casted you as the person that's like, oh, Shaq wanted to stay, but Leonard knew he was going to make so much more money, and the LA, glitz and glamour is going to make Shaq so rich.
Yeah, well, again, he wanted to stay. They know in retrospect that they made a huge mistake by just not offering him a max contract, which he would have signed. And once he was basically insulted, they ran a poll in the Orlando Sentinel. And the poll was, is Shaq worth $100 million? And I think 76% of the people in Orlando said no. And Shaq saw that as being disrespected by the community that he lived in. He's like, well, if they really don't want me, I should really explore other options. And then there was the whole allure of the LA Lakers legacy. LA Lakers had Wilt Chamberlain. They had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They had Jerry West as the general manager. They had Magic Johnson, who was, helping to recruit Shaq. I mean, they had, quite a bit to offer. And by the way, the 13th pick in the NBA draft that year ended up being Kobe Bryant. So because of the salary cap move that we forced the Lakers to make, Kobe Bryant became a Laker. Otherwise, he never would have been there. So the Lakers
explain that one more. Wait. It was because of the move you guys made.
Yeah, because we required the Lakers to make more cap room for Shaquille. So to get to the $121 million mark, they had the trade that included Vlade Divac and the first round pick of the Charlotte Hornets, which became Kobe Bryant. So without that move, without that trade, Kobe would have never been a Laker. So Kobe had Shaq to thank for being a Laker. The Lakers have Shaq to thank for getting Kobe. And the Lakers fans have Shaq to thank for that whole dynasty, because it all resulted because of that move that they had to make to get Shaq.
What a fascinating sliding doors of that whole situation. I mean, especially getting Kobe, because that leads us perfectly into my next question, which is, apart from the Lakers, what other teams called you, and did you take any other offers or teams seriously?
I mean, there was a lot of other teams that called, tons.
Yeah.
And the problem was they either didn't have the cap room, the money, or it didn't look like they could be a contender. And the Lakers were clearly far and away the best option, especially when they made all those moves to clear cap space, and especially because they have that heritage.
Now, you talk a lot about legacy, and you represented Kareem. Were there conversations with these Lakers legends in recruiting Shaq? Like, was that a big part of this?
I think Jerry West handled most of it himself.
Yeah.
But Jerry West has so much, imprimatur, stature, because of what he stood for. He's the NBA logo. He, masterminded championships for the Lakers. So, and he had the respect of everybody. I mean, everyone respected Jerry West. Michael Jordan respected Jerry West. Magic Johnson, everyone. So Jerry West is, Shaq would call him Mr. West. I mean, he commands respect because of his accomplishments.
And now, my last question on this is, being the brand builder that you are, when you initially saw this interest in the Lakers, right, and going to LA, how proactive were you guys with, like, hey, Shaq wants to do hip hop, Shaq wants to act, Shaq wants to be this larger than life personality? Like, how important was the fact of being in LA influencing that decision with, like, Shaq's off the court interest?
Well, I always believed that Shaq transcended markets, and he did from the beginning, because if you remember, he was massive even when he was in Orlando. He had commercials with Reebok, he had commercials with Pepsi, he was tearing down rims on national TV. I mean, everybody knew who he was. It wasn't like he needed to be in LA, to be an international superstar. We were traveling around the world, with Reebok and Pepsi, doing all kinds of appearances in the off season. He was massive even when he was in Orlando. He had commercials with Reebok, he had commercials with Pepsi, he was tearing down rims on national TV. I mean, everybody knew who he was. It wasn't like he needed to be in LA, to be an international superstar. We were traveling around the world, with Reebok and Pepsi, doing all kinds of appearances in the off season. He was already making movies before he moved to LA. He was already doing hip hop. He already had a record deal with Jive Records in his, rookie season. So it was looked down on the forum and said, here's the kinds of things that you can do because of who you are and the kind of person you are and the charisma that you have. So, Shaq has Magic to thank for a lot of great mentorship, and Magic always treated us with tremendous respect and tremendous consideration.
No, I mean, that's what an opportunity, right, for especially you and Shaq to, like, build that brand, right, and create their own kind of Mount Rushmore on this Laker legacy, which at the time was so many legends. It's like, I guess it's a good question of pressure. Like, how did you ever see Shaq a little overwhelmed in these situations? Like, there's a big difference playing in Orlando and playing in LA. Like,
well, he has this funny saying about pressure, and we talk about it a lot. Pressure is something you put on yourself. And when he was young, his dad would drive him around and open the door when he'd see some people that were homeless or didn't have any food. And he'd say, look, You feel pressure with games? No. You know what pressure is? Pressure is when you don't know where your next meal is coming from. So you sort of like put that in perspective. And you have to just look at basketball as one aspect of life and just do your very best when you go out and compete. And if you prepared to compete, it's going to take care of itself on the court. As the famous John Wooden says, failing to prepare is preparing to fail.
Yeah.
So you just have to prepare and then let things flow.
No, I love that. I love that answer as kind of a sum up to that entire topic. But Leonard, thank you so much for joining us for this first episode. And I think, where else are you going to get these personal stories, these legends, right? Like current takes in sports business, and the fact that you can tie all of this together with all of your experience, right? It's like, I think this is my favorite part about building the show with you, is diving into these topics and relating it back to situations you've been through in sports with athletes and on the business side. Like, we're going to have so many more of these stories. Like, this is just the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you did a nice job of like navigating everything too, Vishal. So I think we have a good dialogue, a good rapport, and look forward to continuing this. I hope you feel it was productive, and I hope you feel it will be something that your audience will appreciate.
Oh, yes. No, I think this is a great kickoff, and drop a comment below if you want us to cover anything we didn't hit on this episode, and we'll make sure to get it on the next one. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.